Iran's currency collapse is not just an economic story buried in exchange rates and inflation charts. It is a slow-motion political earthquake that threatens to rewrite the balance of power across the entire Middle East. To understand why this matters far beyond Iran's borders, we first need to understand what a collapsing currency actually means inside a country like Iran, and why this crisis is fundamentally different from past economic shocks the region has seen. For decades, the Iranian Rial has been under pressure, weakened by sanctions, mismanagement, corruption, and isolation from the global financial system. But what we are witnessing now is not a routine devaluation. It is a structural collapse of confidence. When a currency falls this sharply and persistently, it signals that people no longer trust the state to protect the value of their labor, savings, or future. In Iran's case, the rial's decline has turned money itself into a liability. Ordinary citizens rush to convert their earnings into dollars, gold, or even physical goods, not because they want to speculate, but because holding rials feels like holding melting ice. This loss of trust strikes at the heart of state power. A modern government depends on its currency to function. Salaries, subsidies, imports, military budgets, and regional influence are all paid for in money that must be believed in. When belief disappears, the government can still print currency, but every new note printed accelerates inflation, further destroying purchasing power. This creates a vicious cycle where the state becomes trapped between social collapse and financial implosion. Inside Iran, the consequences are already severe. Inflation eats away at middle-class life, turning professionals into survivalists. Businesses cannot plan, investors flee, and youth unemployment rises even higher. But the deeper danger lies in how this economic breakdown transforms society itself. When money loses meaning, people stop thinking long-term. Trust erodes not only in the currency, but in institutions, promises, and leadership. This is how economic crises evolve into legitimacy crises. Iran's political system has survived many shocks, but it has always relied on a core bargain with society. The state promised resistance, stability, and regional strength, while citizens tolerated restrictions in exchange for basic economic security. A collapsing currency shatters this bargain. When people cannot afford food, housing, or medicine, ideology becomes irrelevant. Survival replaces loyalty, and the social contract quietly dissolves. This internal breakdown does not remain contained within Iran's borders. Iran is not an isolated economy in a vacuum. It is a central pillar in the Middle East's geopolitical architecture, connected through energy markets, proxy networks, trade routes, and security arrangements. When Iran's currency collapses, its ability to project power weakens in ways that ripple across the region. Regional influence is expensive. Funding allies, militias, and political movements across the Middle East requires stable cash flow, access to foreign currency, and reliable logistics. As the rial collapses, the cost of maintaining these networks rises dramatically. Paying salaries abroad becomes harder. Supplying equipment becomes more expensive, and loyalty begins to fray. Groups that once relied on consistent Iranian support start looking elsewhere, hedging their bets or fragmenting internally. At the same time, Iran's rivals see opportunity. A financially weakened Iran is less able to deter pressure from regional adversaries. Gulf states, Israel, and global powers recalibrate their strategies, sensing vulnerability. This shifts the balance of deterrence that has kept certain conflicts frozen or limited for years. When one pillar of the regional order weakens, every other actor adjusts, often in destabilizing ways. Energy markets are another critical pressure point. Iran sits on vast oil and gas reserves, but a collapsing currency undermines its ability to invest in infrastructure, maintain production, and negotiate from a position of strength. Energy revenues that once stabilized the economy now fail to keep pace with inflation and currency depreciation. This reduces Iran's leverage in global and regional energy politics, altering supply dynamics and empowering alternative producers. Sanctions amplify this collapse, but they are not the sole cause. Years of economic isolation have created parallel markets, smuggling networks, and shadow economies that benefit a small elite while draining the formal system. As the currency collapses, these informal structures grow stronger, hollowing out the state from within. The government becomes less a national institution and more a manager of crisis, constantly reacting instead of governing. History shows that currency collapses often precede major political transformations. From Latin America to Eastern Europe, when money fails, systems change. Sometimes this leads to reform, but more often it leads to instability, authoritarian tightening, or fragmentation. In Iran's case, the stakes are far higher because of its size, population, and regional entanglements. A destabilized Iran does not simply reform quietly. It reshapes the Middle East around it. Neighboring countries feel the pressure first through refugees, black market trade, and security spillovers. Economic desperation drives migration, while weakened borders enable smuggling and arms flows. Fragile states nearby struggle to absorb these shocks, increasing the risk of localized conflicts turning regional. What begins as a currency crisis becomes a security crisis. The most dangerous aspect of Iran's currency collapse is not immediate chaos, but long-term unpredictability. When a state loses economic control, decision-making becomes erratic. Leaders may take greater risks externally to distract from internal failure, or clamp down internally in ways that provoke backlash. Either path increases volatility in an already unstable region. This is why Iran's currency collapse threatens to destroy the Middle East order as we know it. The current regional system, fragile and imperfect, depends on predictable power centers. Iran has been one of those centers, balancing rivals and anchoring conflicts within certain limits. As its economic foundation erodes, that anchor weakens, and the entire structure begins to shift. As Iran's currency continues its rapid collapse, the effects extend far beyond economic statistics. They begin to unravel the intricate web of alliances and influence that Tehran has built across the Middle East over decades. For Iran, soft power has always been as important as hard power. Its network of proxies, militias, and political allies, from Lebanon's Hezbollah to Shiite factions in Iraq, to the Houthis in Yemen, relies heavily on steady funding, weapons, and logistical support. A weakened Rial threatens to disrupt these networks in ways few outside the region fully appreciate, setting the stage for a dramatic reshaping of Middle Eastern power structures. The first ripple is financial. Maintaining proxy groups is expensive. These organizations require salaries, weapons, training, and supplies, often sourced internationally. With the Rial collapsing, Tehran must convert increasingly worthless currency into dollars or other stable currencies to fund its operations abroad. As conversion becomes more difficult and costly, the amount of support available diminishes, creating strains on the field. Militant leaders accustomed to predictable backing now face uncertainty. This financial squeeze can foster internal tensions, forcing local actors to compete for scarce resources, sometimes even turning against each other. When loyalty is transactional, a financial collapse can quickly translate into political fragmentation. At the same time, Iran's weakened financial standing alters the calculus of its adversaries. Regional rivals such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel closely monitor Iran's economic health, knowing that a financially constrained Tehran is less capable of retaliation or expansion. These states may seize the opportunity to apply pressure, engage in covert operations, or strengthen alliances to counterbalance what was once Iranian dominance in certain theaters. For instance, in Yemen, Saudi-backed forces might intensify campaigns against the Houthis, betting that Iran can no longer sustain long-term support. Similarly, in Iraq and Lebanon, political factions backed by Iran may lose influence as alternative networks backed by Gulf powers or Western actors step in to fill the vacuum. Another critical factor is the erosion of Iran's credibility as a regional power. In Middle Eastern politics, perception is reality. Governments, militias, and local populations assess strength based not only on military capabilities, but also on economic stability and the ability to deliver on promises. When Iran's currency collapses and its domestic economy spirals, the perception of weakness grows. Allies may begin hedging their bets, seeking alternative patrons, or adopting more independent strategies. This erosion of influence is subtle but cumulative, often leading to a gradual decline in Tehran's ability to project power even without overt conflict. Energy politics further magnify the consequences. Iran's oil and gas sector has long been a cornerstone of both its domestic budget and its regional leverage. Currency collapse undermines investment in production infrastructure, maintenance, and exports. Reduced revenues limit the government's capacity to subsidize domestic needs or fund foreign operations. Simultaneously, competitors in the global energy market may gain an advantage as Iran struggles to maintain output. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and even Iraq can exploit this disruption to expand market share and exert geopolitical leverage, further weakening Iran's regional influence. Energy dependency is a critical tool in Middle Eastern diplomacy, and losing that advantage can shift alliances and embolden rivals. Moreover, the Rial collapse fuels internal instability that inevitably spills outward. Economic despair drives social unrest, protests, and political agitation within Iran. Historically, periods of high inflation and currency devaluation correlate with intensified demonstrations and political activism, especially among urban youth and middle-class professionals. As unrest grows, the Iranian state may divert attention and resources from foreign engagement to domestic control. Security forces are stretched, intelligence operations abroad are deprioritized, and the ability to maintain disciplined proxy networks diminishes. In effect, Iran's internal crisis reduces its capacity to influence regional events, creating openings for other powers to act unchallenged. The destabilizing effect also extends to financial networks that operate across borders. Iran has long relied on informal banking systems, hawala networks, and clandestine trade routes to bypass sanctions and fund regional allies. A collapsing currency strains these networks, raising transaction costs and increasing the risk of default or fraud. Partners abroad may be reluctant to continue cooperation under financial uncertainty, further isolating Tehran. For instance, militia groups in Lebanon or Iraq may receive delayed payments or reduced supplies, forcing them to source funds independently. Such shifts often increase criminal activity, corruption, and local tensions, creating a cascade of instability that spreads regionally. The geopolitical vacuum created by Iran's weakening is particularly consequential in conflict zones where multiple powers compete. In Syria, for example, Iranian influence has been a stabilizing factor for the Assad regime, providing military support, advisors, and economic assistance. With funding constrained by currency collapse, Iran's ability to maintain its role diminishes, potentially empowering other actors like Russia, Turkey, or even Israel to expand their influence. A recalibration in Syria could have domino effects across the Levant, affecting Lebanon's fragile political balance, Jordan's security concerns, and even Palestinian politics. The collapse of a single economic pillar, currency value, therefore reverberates across complex networks of alliances, creating uncertainty and instability. The psychological dimension of Iran's collapse is equally critical. Economic weakness signals vulnerability not only to rivals, but to its own population. When ordinary citizens witness their government struggling to maintain even basic functions, trust erodes. This loss of confidence can manifest as protests, strikes, or immigration, weakening social cohesion and political authority. Neighboring states may face increased refugee flows, cross-border crime, and a rise in illicit economic activity. The collapse of one country's currency can thus act as a regional contagion, destabilizing neighboring societies and economies in unexpected ways. Perhaps most dangerously, a financially weakened Iran may resort to riskier foreign policies to distract from domestic crises. Historically, regimes facing internal pressure have sometimes pursued aggressive or provocative actions abroad to rally nationalist sentiment and deflect attention. This creates the potential for miscalculations or escalations in already tense environments. Conflicts that were previously contained, such as skirmishes in the Gulf, proxy battles in Yemen, or cyber operations against adversaries, could intensify, producing outcomes that are difficult to predict and potentially catastrophic for regional stability. Finally, the collapse of the Rial threatens the Middle East's broader strategic balance. For decades, regional powers have operated within an informal equilibrium where Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, and other actors maintain a fragile but predictable balance of influence. This balance is not peaceful, but it has kept full-scale wars in check. A currency collapse undermines one of the key pillars of this system, introducing uncertainty and volatility that ripple through alliances, conflicts, and negotiations. The Middle East, already fraught with historical grievances and sectarian divides, becomes far more unpredictable when a major player like Iran is destabilized economically. In summary, Iran's currency collapse is not just an economic story, it is a geopolitical earthquake. It undermines the state's ability to fund allies, erodes credibility and influence, shifts the calculations of rivals, and destabilizes conflict zones across the region. Financial collapse and social unrest feed into each other, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that threatens to redraw the map of power in the Middle East. In the next part, we will examine the international dimensions of this crisis, including the roles of global powers, sanctions, and foreign financial networks, and how they might accelerate the destruction of the existing Middle East order. The ramifications of Iran's currency collapse extend far beyond the Middle East, drawing in global powers and exposing the vulnerabilities of international financial systems. While the crisis may appear, at first glance, as a domestic issue confined to Tehran, the reality is that Iran occupies a pivotal role in regional and global networks. From energy markets to global trade routes, from financial channels to diplomatic alliances, the weakening of the Rial reverberates across multiple continents, threatening to destabilize not just the Middle East, but global economic and security architectures. One of the most immediate international effects is on energy markets. Iran is a major oil and gas producer, and its production capacity is closely linked to its economic stability. When the currency collapses, the state struggles to maintain its infrastructure, pay for imports, or invest in extraction technologies. Reduced production capacity, even if temporary, sends shockwaves through global energy prices. Markets are highly sensitive to disruptions in Iranian supply, not just because of the physical barrels that may be lost, but because traders and investors factor Iran's instability into the risk premium of the entire region. This creates volatility that affects nations far removed from Tehran, from European energy consumers to Asian industrial powerhouses, demonstrating how a local currency crisis can cascade into global economic turbulence. Sanctions, historically a key tool of Western pressure on Iran, amplify the effects of the currency collapse. They not only restrict access to international markets, but also increase the cost and difficulty of essential transactions. Iran's attempts to bypass sanctions through alternative financial networks, informal banking, barter trade, or cryptocurrency are complicated by the rapid depreciation of the rial. As trust in the local currency evaporates, foreign partners, whether state actors or private entities, hesitate to engage with Iran, fearing defaults or sudden losses in value. This reluctance isolates Tehran further, undermining both its domestic economy and its ability to influence regional politics. What might have been a manageable economic slowdown now becomes a multi-layered crisis with both domestic and international dimensions. The financial contagion extends into neighboring countries. Iran's economy is tightly intertwined with Iraq, Afghanistan, and parts of the Gulf, not only through trade, but also via informal cross-border networks. As the rial loses value, these trade routes falter. Goods become more expensive, smuggling increases, and regional black markets grow in importance. Nations bordering Iran must contend with sudden price fluctuations, shortages of essential commodities, and increased criminal activity, creating a ripple effect that threatens regional stability. These economic pressures can exacerbate political tensions in fragile states, where even minor disruptions risk triggering unrest. Diplomatic influence, a critical tool of Tehran's regional strategy, is also undermined. Over decades, Iran has cultivated alliances with governments, political parties, and militant groups across the Middle East. Maintaining these relationships requires a constant flow of resources, financial, military, and logistical. When the rial collapses, Tehran's ability to sustain these channels diminishes, weakening its bargaining power and credibility. Allies dependent on Iranian support may begin seeking alternative patrons, whether in Moscow, Ankara, or Gulf capitals. The reconfiguration of these networks threatens to shift the geopolitical balance, potentially emboldening rivals and creating space for previously suppressed conflicts to escalate. Global powers observe these dynamics closely. Russia, the United States, and China all have stakes in the Middle East, and Iran's internal fragility presents both opportunities and risks. For Moscow, a weakened Tehran could disrupt its influence in Syria and limit the coordination of energy and military strategies. Washington may perceive an opportunity to apply additional pressure, recalibrate alliances, and influence regional conflicts. Beijing, heavily invested in energy and trade with the region, must consider the risk to long-term projects and supply chains. Each actor en masse response to Iran, as currency collapse, is informed by a delicate balance between exploiting opportunity and avoiding instability that could backfire on global interests. The interplay between domestic unrest and international tension creates a feedback loop that intensifies the crisis. Rising inflation, unemployment, and poverty spark protests and social agitation within Iran. The state's response, often involving repression or austerity measures, can inflame dissent further. International actors may react to human rights violations or humanitarian crises, increasing diplomatic pressure or imposing new sanctions. These external interventions, in turn, can exacerbate economic instability, reduce investor confidence, and further weaken the rial. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing, with domestic and international pressures feeding into each other, accelerating the collapse of both economic and political order. Currency collapse also influences the strategies of non-state actors. Proxy militias, insurgent groups, and regional political organizations that have historically relied on Iranian funding are forced to adapt. Some may splinter, competing for limited resources or shifting allegiance to other regional powers. Others may engage in illicit activity, such as smuggling or criminal enterprises, to sustain themselves independently of Tehran. These shifts increase unpredictability in conflict zones, complicating counterterrorism and stabilization efforts for both regional and international actors. What begins as a financial issue within Iran rapidly transforms into a strategic challenge with global implications. The psychological impact on markets and international stakeholders should not be underestimated. Currency instability signals deeper systemic risk. Investors, both regional and global, begin to reassess exposure to Middle Eastern assets. Businesses reconsider trade with Iran or the broader region, fearing supply chain disruptions, legal complications, or financial losses. Sovereign risk ratings may deteriorate, further increasing borrowing costs for not only Iran, but potentially other Middle Eastern economies linked through trade and investment networks. The collapse of confidence, once it reaches a tipping point, can create a crisis of perception that is as damaging as the underlying economic reality. Moreover, Iran's weakening currency indirectly affects humanitarian conditions across the Middle East. As domestic purchasing power collapses, Iran struggles to provide basic services, healthcare, and food security. Shortages and rising prices ripple into neighboring countries, particularly in border regions where trade and migration are tightly coupled. Refugee flows may increase, local economies become strained, and tensions with host communities escalate. These humanitarian pressures create additional burdens for international actors, further entangling the crisis in a web of political, economic, and security challenges that extend far beyond Iran itself. The cumulative effect of these dynamics is the erosion of the regional order. For decades, the Middle East has been defined by a delicate balance among major powers, both state and non-state. Iran has functioned as one of the central pillars in this system, managing alliances, deterring adversaries, and projecting influence. As the Rial collapses, this pillar weakens, introducing uncertainty that destabilizes existing arrangements. Conflicts that were previously frozen or contained risk reigniting, while new rivalries emerge, reshaping alliances and territorial influence. What begins as an economic failure in Tehran evolves into a transformative geopolitical event with consequences that reverberate across the globe. In conclusion, Iran's currency collapse is a multidimensional crisis with both domestic and international consequences. It undermines energy markets, strains regional alliances, diminishes diplomatic influence, and creates humanitarian pressures that extend beyond Iran's borders. Global powers respond in ways that can either stabilize or further destabilize the region, depending on their strategies. The unraveling of Iran's economic foundation threatens to destroy the fragile balance of the Middle East, setting in motion a chain of events that could reshape the order of the region permanently. In the final part, we will examine the likely scenarios for the Middle East in the wake of this crisis, exploring potential conflicts, the future of regional alliances, and what the world can expect as Tehran struggles to regain stability. As Iran's currency collapse continues to unravel the economic and political fabric of the country, the Middle East stands on the brink of a profound transformation. The consequences that have been quietly building over months are now reaching a critical juncture, and the region faces a period of uncertainty that could redefine power, alliances, and conflicts for decades to come. Understanding these potential scenarios is crucial, not just for analysts and policymakers, but for anyone seeking to grasp how a single economic failure in Tehran can ripple across borders, societies, and global strategies. One of the most immediate effects of the Rial-Erous collapse is the intensification of domestic instability in Iran. Inflation, unemployment, and rising poverty have already eroded the daily lives of ordinary citizens. As survival becomes the dominant concern, social cohesion weakens. Protests, strikes, and local uprisings are likely to increase, challenging the government's ability to maintain authority. In an environment where the state's control is partially dependent on economic stability, this could lead to a vicious cycle. Unrest destabilizes the economy further, which in turn fuels more discontent. Historical patterns suggest that such crises rarely resolve quickly. And in Iran's case, the scale and complexity of the collapse point to prolonged instability. The erosion of domestic stability directly affects Tehran's regional influence. Iran's ability to fund and coordinate with allied militias, political factions, and proxy groups diminishes sharply when the Rial loses value. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen may find themselves forced to operate with limited resources. This strain can fracture alliances, reduce operational effectiveness, and even cause shifts in loyalty. As a result, the carefully maintained balance of power that Iran has built over decades begins to crumble. Rivals, sensing vulnerability, may attempt to fill the vacuum, whether through military pressure, diplomatic maneuvers, or economic leverage. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel are among the regional actors poised to take advantage of Iran's weakness. In Yemen, Saudi-backed forces may intensify operations against the Houthis, exploiting reduced Iranian support. In Lebanon and Iraq, political factions historically reliant on Tehran may realign toward alternative sponsors, further shifting local power dynamics. These developments are not isolated. They interact with existing conflicts and rivalries, potentially triggering wider instability. The Middle East, already a complex patchwork of sectarian, ethnic, and political tensions, faces a domino effect where one disruption cascades into multiple arenas simultaneously. Global powers are also deeply invested in these unfolding events. The United States, Russia, and China all have strategic interests in the region, ranging from energy security to military influence. Iran's weakened currency and internal instability force these powers to reconsider their approaches. Washington may see an opportunity to tighten economic pressure and recalibrate alliances, while Moscow evaluates the implications for its role in Syria and energy politics. Beijing, heavily invested in trade and infrastructure projects, must weigh the risks to its long-term Middle Eastern ambitions. Each decision by external actors interacts with the internal crisis, sometimes stabilizing but often exacerbating instability, creating a delicate and unpredictable geopolitical environment. The economic collapse also has profound implications for the global energy market. Iran's reduced capacity to produce and export oil and gas affects not only regional competitors, but global supply chains. Prices may fluctuate unpredictably, creating volatility that affects economies far removed from Tehran. Countries dependent on stable energy imports from Europe to Asia may face unexpected shocks. Investors and businesses recalibrate risk assessments, potentially reducing trade and investment in the region. In this sense, Iran's currency crisis has evolved into a global economic concern, demonstrating how deeply interconnected the Middle East is with world markets. Another critical dimension is the humanitarian impact. Economic collapse leads to scarcity, rising prices, and reduced access to essential goods and services. This pushes more Iranians to seek refuge abroad, straining neighboring countries like Iraq, Turkey, and Pakistan. Border tensions may rise, local economies may be stressed, and social unrest can spread beyond Iran's borders. In a region already dealing with displaced populations, fragile governance, and sectarian divides, the ripple effects of mass migration could exacerbate existing conflicts and create new crises that draw in both regional and international actors. Looking forward, several scenarios emerge. In one scenario, Iran's government manages to stabilize the economy through a combination of reforms, selective engagement with international partners, and austerity measures. While this could slow the collapse, it may come at the cost of widespread public dissatisfaction and continued social unrest. In another, the economic crisis deepens, leading to internal political fragmentation, weakening Tehran's ability to project power abroad, and accelerating shifts in regional alliances. A third, more extreme scenario involves overt conflict, either through proxy wars or direct confrontation, triggered by the perception of Iranian vulnerability and the ambitions of rival powers. In all scenarios, one thing is clear. The collapse of Iran's currency is not merely a financial event. It is a strategic earthquake with the power to reshape the Middle East. Alliances, conflicts, and the balance of power are all affected, as are global markets and humanitarian conditions. The existing order, which has been fragile but relatively predictable, faces unprecedented uncertainty. Policymakers, analysts, and observers alike must recognize that Iran-HRAOS domestic economic crisis is now inseparable from regional and global security considerations. The lesson of Iran's currency collapse is also a warning for other nations in the region. Economic mismanagement, over-reliance on a single currency, and isolation from global financial systems can create vulnerabilities with far-reaching consequences. As Tehran struggles to navigate this crisis, neighboring states are forced to adapt rapidly, sometimes in destabilizing ways. The Middle East, historically shaped by shifting power dynamics, is entering a phase where unpredictability and volatility may become the new norm. Ultimately, the collapse of the rial is more than numbers on a ledger. It is a catalyst for transformation. Social contracts, political alliances, and economic structures are being tested in real time. What unfolds in Iran over the next months and years will determine not just its own fate, but the trajectory of an entire region. The Middle East order, as it has existed for decades, may be irreversibly altered. If you want to stay informed about how global events like this reshape our world and want the latest updates on Middle Eastern geopolitics, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future analysis. This is Hidden History Vault, bringing you the stories behind the headlines and the forces shaping our future.